Hello and welcome. This would be part 1 of a 2-part review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. This part will cover Rebirth's gameplay, world building, and level design while avoiding story discussions for the next part. Alright, so, one of the primary focuses the developers sought to improve going from Remake to Rebirth was its combat. Rebirth's combat is a balance between the real-time strategy of older Final Fantasy ATB systems and FF12's live action, which helps it excel in style but limits the efficiency the party has. Player-controlled characters will always build ATB the fastest, which helps achieve the most entertaining parts of combat, but the AI will struggle in comparison offensively. The flip side is the AI will excel defensively, and even perfect parry moves consistently in tight situations. This means switching off to characters who aren't being attacked is incentivized, and will save you the difficulty of timing blocks so that the AI can instead. Older Final Fantasies, including one previously mentioned, not only made how AI party members attack, block, and parry more sensible and predictable, but comes the closest to crafting one of the most efficient AI-controlled party systems in the series. Final Fantasy XII seamlessly ties its AI blocking and parrying with its equipment. Equipping shields, certain accessories, or even tiles on the license board all give players the control to improve the AI's chance to block and parry, while Rebirth only gives reduction to blocked damage and increased parry windows. Offensively, Rebirth's AI barely competes with the auto-attack functions of games decades earlier, let alone 12. You'd think one of the series' best solutions to party AI in the Gambit system wouldn't be designated to a damn minigame when it alleviates the problem with Rebirth's AI. Even if most of the excitement and tension built from Rebirth's combat comes from player-controlled interactions, there was plenty to take from its own series or the genre in order to make the AI function a lot better. In order to compensate with how underwhelming the AI can be, auto-cast and auto-ability materia have been added and expanded upon from Remake. But the absence of the utility that the Gambit system from 12 provides in terms of combat, like who to target, when to use it, and several other unique mechanics display how disappointing Rebirth AI is. It's a real shame, since the AI's ability to build ATB and block would be a quick and easy way to give player tangible control over their party's builds, something much more quantifiable and rewarding than how they currently know when enemies attack or do absolutely nothing. Player-controlled combat excels at giving dozens of beneficial options, with a progressive set of resources that grow in power and utility as the fights go on. Defensively, there is plenty of risk and reward to account for when analyzing any situation. Blocking requires the press of a button and can exponentially decrease incoming damage, but limits the offensive window afterward. Parrying an attack is much more difficult but gives a large window to attack from, can pressure enemies, and quickly becomes an important skill to master in combat. The greatest defensive options will require precise timing of certain abilities, leaving you quite vulnerable on a miss but can lead to devastating counterattacks. Rebirth's mechanics allow for players to dramatically increase chances of winning by learning attack patterns and properly timing defensive options. Synergy abilities, on the other hand, have a unique resource that the player must account for through synergy charges. You gain these by using ATB on weapon abilities, meaning the player has to utilize their whole team effectively in order to get the 3 or 4 charges to unleash powerful attacks. Because synergy skills are tied to having a teammate on the field, which in turn ties in well with the themes of the game. Aerith's rather frail defensively, so she can bring bodyguards over. Barrett can bolster his defenses as the tank of the group. Cloud can produce physical or magical damage depending on the teammate, and Tifa can fly. Theoretically, this system would benefit the cyclical nature of combat, but the ATB system artificially limits the frequency of synergy abilities. The player-controlled party member will often fill their ATB bar quite fast and expend it whenever. But AI party members will often struggle with getting just 1 bar without player interference. This is especially annoying for tense scenarios and boss fights, where the player may notice that their teammates aren't attacking enough when they could have already acquired a bar of ATB in the time it takes to switch over to them. Once ATB is built, Rebirth gives an abundance of custom controller commands for the party members they aren't controlling. How the player uses these commands come from the weapons they use, one of the staple points to the pacing of combat. The game proliferates its abilities through weapon-based skills that show up periodically, and are placed in very obvious areas so that the players don't miss them. Because weapon abilities can be learned for all weapons through a proficiency meter, combat can be more than just an XP and gil resource as long as the requirements aren't painfully easy. Weapons will be invaluable and of the highest priority to find, but will never be too hard to miss because of how crucial they are to the depth of the combat system. Rebirth's exploration won't be littered with hidden and rare items, so it's disappointing they're almost always adjacent to the critical path with how big the open world is. Limits remain as effective and flashy as ever, but they should have taken a page out of the original's flawed limit system and tweaked the obvious problems. The original struggles with how cryptic acquiring certain limits are, restricting them to optional items and events that are entirely missable. However, dedicated players could acquire some of the best limits before even leaving Midgard. Rebirth takes the complete opposite approach by giving everyone 2 limits to start and 1 limit that they will eventually have access to. Limits and synergy abilities are both unlocked in the folio tree, and weapons will almost always be found on the main path, so acquiring the best abilities comes from grinding towers and progressing the story. Rebirth consistently has the option to hide rare rewards throughout its open world, but doesn't trust its players enough to actually explore its open world, somehow. It comes off as antithetical to how JRPGs can create satisfying experiences when combing through each map, talking with NPCs, finding secret pathways, and ultimately acquiring quality rewards. Even if certain secrets and events in the original could be too difficult and require some kind of guide, Rebirth forgoes any type of this exploration for accessibility and linearity. The benefit to Rebirth's limit system is in the combat mechanics. Higher level limits are restricted by synergy abilities that upgrade limit levels, meaning limits don't instantly give you the strongest moves in the game to start the fight. The cyclical nature of attacking, synergizing, and using ATB in order to acquire a limit engages its own mechanics meaningfully, but there could have been much more integration between acquiring limits and other core mechanics. The stagger system continues from Remake with certain spells and high-powered abilities increasing stagger meters so that powerful limits and synergy abilities can be used afterward. Not only do the synergy abilities provide valuable buffs like unlimited MP or increased stagger windows, but they stun lock enemies similar to limits, giving players more utility when not using the most important of materias, Assess. Assess materia removes the trial and error of encounters similar to that of other RPGs in order to give the player a comprehensive stat sheet of 99% of the game's enemies and their weaknesses. Other JRPGs have consistently dealt with the problem of how the player will go about acquiring knowledge on enemies without completely telling the player everything they need to know. The Persona series has crafted a risk-reward situation with every enemy they face, with each enemy having a hidden set of weaknesses and resistances that will be unknown to the player until exploited. The player learns valuable information from risking certain moves on enemies, knowing that it could have zero effect or even heal the enemy. A risk-reward system Assess forgoes. Experimenting with enemy weaknesses is a crucial part to survival in Persona as well, since the player might not be able to finish an enemy until an additional weakness is found, or by finding the specific damage that isn't nullified. Considering Assess materia will explicitly tell the player exactly the kind of actions to take as well as the actions the enemies might take, then experimenting in Rebirth is quite literally not using the Assess materia, which isn't something the game itself incentivizes. The game heavily incentivizes its usage by giving you additional benefits outside of combat through Chadley. The later the game gets, the more difficult it is to figure out what weaknesses each enemy or boss has. If you eliminate the potential satisfaction that figuring out how to pressure an enemy has for a player, especially if the enemy has unique tells or aspects that make defeating it natural for its size, shape, or environment, then you're eliminating a part of Final Fantasy that the series has already been exceptional with, as well as ignoring plenty of other games in the space who've overcome this problem already. There are other aspects of Rebirth's combat that make dealing with certain foes and difficult adversaries painfully easy. The game showers you with items through its rewards, crafting system, and vendors, as well as plenty of money to spend, meaning players can easily dish out items by using iframes and painfully easy moves to fill ATB. The game will continuously give ways to hoard healing items and fully heal the party before each and every fight, except for on hard mode. Instead of remotely trying to balance the abundance of items, benches, or vendor locations, they continued Remake's trend of hard mode completely disabling all consumables. Items have always been an essential aspect of the series, with certain balancing issues in each of their games respectively. But removing a core feature in order to inflate the difficulty is just another example of throwing in the towel mechanically instead of dynamically changing from easier difficulties. It negates many of the crafting recipes, every item shop, and even materia like Item Economizer, which allows the use of items without ATB periodically. These examples demonstrate how one or two correct restrictions or reworks could bring about a hard mode that balances the many aspects of Rebirth that trivializes the game, like Economizer materia paired with the dozens of quality consumables. But there is so much more to fix to ever come close to having balanced difficulties between either or. It's a real shame because both sides suffer because the difficulty scaling just had to exist in the first place, with one giving way too many resources every step of the way with plenty of methods to stay fully healed, while the other negates basic functions and utilities that neglect to change in accordance to these restrictions. Not to mention the lack of dynamically changing between enemy movesets and abilities in favor for flat number increases across the board in hard mode, and the dream of a standardized experience in order to facilitate better mechanics feels like a delusion tossed away to time. Another new addition to combat is backline commands, giving the members out of the party who remain distant in the battlefield a free synergy ability after a certain amount of time. I love how they keep the non-party members in the fights, even if their damage output is inconsequential. It's a thematic inclusion that doesn't dramatically make fights easier but keeps combat more immersive than had they just phased out. A consistent theme in the game will be represented in the teamwork and relationships built from Remake and continued in Rebirth, with combat being one of those focal points. Boss fights will typically be the most satisfying experience for players through the combat. These fights need a certain amount of tension, whether it be through the difficulty or the mechanics of the boss itself, in order to put the player in uncomfortable reactionary positions where they might need to heal, revive, or change strategies. If the player can just breeze through the fight using the best mechanics or reading the cheat sheet, it makes it harder for the developers to make each combat encounter meaningful. The player could be overleveled, have hundreds of potions to use, spam iframe moves, or abuse the party AI and alleviate the tension of fights by trivializing its own mechanics. This is why boss encounters typically have the most impact in Rebirth and will keep players reacting and capitalizing on critical moments of a fight. These methods can be extra limbs, additional phases, restricted party members, or events that occur during the fight that helps elicit more satisfaction upon completion.
Nothing personal.
Boss fights will often have multiple kinds of weaknesses or ways to pressure them that are more thought-provoking when used without the assess materia. Some bosses return from Remake and provide the most innovative experiences, while quality can be a mixed bag. Most basic enemies will lose the tension and satisfaction associated with fighting after every few encounters, especially mobs at the bottom of towers. So the boss fights and their mechanics are critical to whether you'll be satisfied while playing. One thing that really stood out to me through all of Rebirth's world design was how well designed the cities, towns, and populated areas are. Walking around urban areas and hearing the voices of dozens of people per area giving subtle nods and clues to the lore and world building is really refreshing to see. Ignoring the main cast, the people of the world seem believable because of how often they are reacting and referencing world events. This is without the incorporation of almost everyone in the main cast encounters, as well as most of the actions they take, as the plot has problems I will get into in the next part that affects how the NPCs react and act around the main party. The biggest change to the world building of FF7 Rebirth is the open world areas. Regardless of how open world Rebirth is, it costs them in how each area suffers from repetitiveness. Each area is distinctly made up of several towers spanning the map that guide the player to other side quests. Certain side quests like Summon Shrines and Mako Springs can be encountered without the use of towers, but will unlock more events through Chadley, who gives the player dig sites in elite enemy fights. The game heavily relies on chocobo traversal purely to get through areas quickly while sometimes restricting entire sections of the map. The side effect of such easy traveling systems is the developers don't have to fill in the gaps of the map with meaningful content. They can plop noteworthy locations anywhere on the map and just tell the player where to go. Tie that in with the incredibly generous fast travel system and traversal becomes one of the biggest nuisances to your open world game. Each area does offer a proto-relic questline, which is a mixed bag in terms of fun but are generally of high quality mechanically. Since all of these aspects are optional, then it fully relies on the player's discretion on whether they engage with any of its world maps. The game specifically allows for the player to only have to complete the main story, with very little overworld actions required, and this is where the pacing problems really begin to shine. Every single time the player steps into an area, there will be the same exact dozens of pre-generated landmarks that repeat the same mechanically unengaging processes. Even the proto-relic quests show how often the same assets can be duplicated throughout each area with little purpose besides the difficulty of reaching it in the first place. It's an all too common approach used to deal with the task of making its traversal meaningful. In Rebirth, we get climbing sections, chocobo traversal, and grapple hooks. I'm so glad this was your takeaway. Once you have arrived to whichever destination, the quality of the minigame or side quest will be a coin toss, with some a joy to play, even emotionally satisfying or mechanically well made, while others truly make me question what went wrong. Furthermore, I fear most players will find themselves enjoying these activities simply because they are different than all of the other trivialities used to fill up space in the overworld. Even side quests and elite enemies render portions of the open world barren until certain NPCs or Mako Springs are collected, further squashing the desire to explore its open world in favor of telling you when it will matter and landmark hunting.
Incredible!
Personally, I feel the average player will engage with a lot of the early game world exploration only to realize how many times they'll have to go tower climbing or tedious button puzzling and burn themselves out. This feels like one of the biggest problems with Rebirth, and the traversal of late game areas will only make finding each of these landmarks more difficult to reach. As for the exploration itself, some areas are gorgeous and provide an incredibly vivid experience that expands upon the premise of the original world areas thoroughly. The last region in particular meshes traversal with beautiful scenery very well. Even with all the mechanical issues tied to the open world aspects, the game continues to provide consistently stunning environments as you progress. Chocobos help to show off the best of each scenery, allowing for flying and sailing across vivid topographies. While some genuinely make traversal compelling and thought-provoking, others highlight how much empty space areas tend to have. Many side quests and unlockable events will render certain points of the map dead zones. Basically glorified hallways that if explored will lead to some crafting material and nothing else. Crafting is quite underwhelming and often provides another means of procuring items that render the game even easier, and provides most of its importance in quests. Enemy encounters with rare species are some of the most interesting fights in the game when trying to achieve each of its parameters, as some will have enemy-specific prompts that provide more depth to combat. Rare enemy encounters would be some of the most enjoyable fights in the game if Mai's addition to Rebirth didn't constantly spew exposition every time you fought them. Mai is another programmed robot similar to Chadley who specifically helps with field battles. Her inclusion seems arbitrary at best with how Chadley can handle everything that she adds to the game. There wasn't any reason for Chadley to craft her in the first place, and half the time she's just butting heads with Chadley anyways. Chadley's increased role in Rebirth's story seemed like a focal point to finding him more likable as he appears in each area, town, and even specific parts in the main story. The best thing that Chadley offers mechanically is the materia he gives per each area you explore. The newly found materia Chadley develops gives the player a substantial reason to explore towers and areas outside of their own benefits because of how strong they can be. The new addition of the enemy skill materia Chadley gives would be one of the most beneficial materias in the game if it wasn't dramatically downsized from the original, and blocked behind assessing unique enemies per area, essentially forcing you to equip assess throughout the entire game if you desire a limited pool of enemy skills. Chadley's other combat options typically unlock a variety of strong and weak materia, with some giving just wind materia and others giving the best summons in the game. Summon battles will offer players the most difficult fights in the game, and depending on how daring you are can be more difficult or less difficult based on the amount of summon shrines collected. Not only will weakening these literal behemoths be of importance for those seeking out summon materia, but getting these relatively quick and easy landmarks will net you more Chadley points for his shop. Even better is that the third shrine found per each summon typically unlocks the best ability one can use for that summon. The worst thing Chadley adds is an additional cutscene at the end of every completed landmark, meaning the player will hear Chadley say the same exact unskippable dialogue lines after each of the 100 or so landmarks throughout. Besides some monotonous button puzzles and some absolutely asinine overworld minigames, the biggest problem the overworld has isn't any singular part of the Grasslands or Junon, but how each overworld's repetitive nature of finding a tower, then a life spring, then a combat encounter, and repeat can ruin the player's pacing. It is a step up from Remake, since most of the overworld stuff will be optional, and instead of forcing side quests in order to just reach the story sections, Rebirth always offers a way to progress the story or continue side questing. Dungeon design feels like one of the most important aspects that Rebirth needed to excel in, but it missed the mark. The way the dungeons work are by putting certain groups of characters together in order to facilitate a certain team composition. This kind of level design should be encouraged, if not fully enforced, by the payoffs they can have for their characters. There are infinite methods of procuring character out of these limited party formats, but the problem lies in being able to tie that in with how the plot develops. Bundle that together with an emphasis on certain mechanics that make that specific set of characters unique together, and you can have yourself some really compelling level design. Unfortunately, Rebirth often puts characters together for ridiculous reasons, one particular moment being decided by a "why not you?" and their inclusion is typically to facilitate the party getting to the next plot point, rendering several parts as padding. Players will absolutely gravitate towards certain character playstyles, efficient or not, and removing those characters from the party has to be done for good reason or else it will ruin it for that player. These dungeons will also have a unique overworld skill for each character. These are not all made the same and makes me question why they made some of the levels in the first place. In fact, it's pretty embarrassing that some of the mechanics of Rebirth and other AAA games get a pass when its use for level progression rivals the damn 90s. Level design won't improve substantially by the end of the game, but at least you can add the adjective unique next to tedious and nonsensical. At least each dungeon ends with fights that will have differing requirements that make them more interesting than the typical one. Once again, the assess material will just tell you exactly what to do, or at minimum guidelines to pressure and ultimately staggering. But a few endgame bosses will make the critical moments of the fight dramatic and enticing, even with a plan. Certain bosses and Rebirth's difficulty in general make each heal and item use theoretically more important, and a higher difficulty will typically yield more engaging fights. This comes with its own problems through the difficulty selection, being that hard mode might have the best experience the game can offer but comes with all the bloated HP and damage boosts. Finding the right difficulty for combat is already going to be complex to gauge, as certain fights even in normal mode can be difficult for a host of reasons. But the hard difficulty will require the most engagement with mechanics, materia, and synergy. One of the highest priorities for Square when making Rebirth and ultimately the trilogy was making sure to create compelling graphics. So many scenes in Rebirth are done for spectacle and to show off impressive graphical capabilities. This seems like it's most important for Square because of its effect on sales and marketing. Being able to recreate one of the most timeless experiences and updating it to feature fantastic animations of fan-favorite heroes. They certainly did create a gorgeous looking game, but the cost of a game like this has been its story. And it leads me to believe that even with the highest graphical fidelity imaginable, Rebirth needed to realign its priorities and selling points. The game will have the lighting and shading bug out from time to time, but it is graphically more consistent than its writing, that's for sure. Another thing of praise would be its soundtrack. Composers, singers, and voice actors alike managed to create profoundly entertaining pieces of music. One specific song stands out to me by incorporating the story's themes alongside a beautiful performance from the singer. Even if the themes are a jumbled mess, there are still some wonderful things that come alongside it. I don't quite know how to wrap my head around this, but this game has an absurd amount of minigames. It's kind of impressive how mixed the quality of all the minigames are, with some being absolutely exceptional and others being ridiculously boring. And don't ever make me go chocobo hunting like this again, I swear to. The amount of extra content and additional levels for the minigames is pleasantly surprising, even if some aren't handled as best they could. The most concerning issue with an abundance of minigames is the several control schemes that vary greatly from combat. The strategy-based minigames don't suffer from the genre change certain minigames have because placing units or building robots is self-explanatory and pausable, meaning there's plenty of ways for the player to pace out their own gameplay and strategy. Minigames like Run Wild come close to having interesting mechanics with the enemy AIs and multiple goals, but Red's underdeveloped controls is a jarring shift that quickly gets replaced with billiards afterward, ignoring the interesting concept Run Wild could have had for hit colored ball in colored goal. Other minigames mimic the quick-time button presses of Mako Springs, with the difficulty of Tifa sit-ups being where your eyes focus, and how much patience you have for the boxing's obnoxious wind-ups. Froggy Fall Guys can be a funny gag when you first find it. Its mechanical depth comparatively weaker than something like a Gears and Gambits, but surprisingly can be more fun than other minigames when viewed after the cesspool of filler and cringe. Meanwhile, they go above and beyond to make sure minigames like Fort Condor and Gears and Gambits have plenty of customizability, extra levels, in-depth strategies, and some of the most interesting gameplay in the entire game. Because there are so many ways to customize the robots and teams in these mini-games, it gives the player plenty of options for overcoming any difficulty, and even ties in multiple ways to beat each level. It's pretty shocking that these games are so well designed for their significance in the game, being that they can be entirely skipped in a moment's notice. It's entirely a mosh pit of quality, but the peak of this quality would definitely be Queen's Blood. It's an essential part of Rebirth's main quest and plenty of additional side quests, and thankfully is one of, if not the highest quality minigame, not in short part due to how much Queen's Blood there is in Rebirth. The game itself features several ways to strategize your decks, from buffing nearby tiles for game-winning effects to eliminating opponents' creatures and taking up spots in their back ranks. This card game will keep you busy throughout Rebirth. The game offers dozens of differing opponents, each with their own set of strategies and cards to put your skills to the test. Collecting cards is an enticing part of Queen's Blood on its own, with several stores selling booster packs to help find that card to complete your deck, or opponents who, if you can best, will reward you with the highest rarity cards in the game. Because the player will acquire cards, new boosters, players, and side quests at the beginning of each area, it gives the player ample ways to grow and expand their collection, while knowing new, stronger opponents will be available once they progress the main story. Rebirth clearly had a focus on crafting several kinds of experiences and mechanics completely separate from the combat, and ironically found several that make experiencing just that part of the entirety of Rebirth worth it, even with the roadblocks like where and when it can be found. When it comes to the story and characters, most of the positive things I have to say rely on combat, short conversations, quips, side quests, and overworld travel. Barrett and Yuffie's personalities bounce off one another quite well, crafting wonderful scenes of humor and levity while also having some seriously compelling emotional beats. Rebirth will consistently have comedic relief moments throughout all of its chapters, and surprisingly paces its comedic moments well within regards to how often the story tackles several morose topics and themes. Rebirth has a few themes that have been built up over the two games, with the most common one being how each character's past feels like an inescapable obstacle that continues to hinder their present. Barrett can't escape the guilt he has from the actions in his hometown. Aerith can't escape the dread of never seeing Zack again. Tifa, alongside Barrett, can't get over the losses they experienced in Remake, being Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie. Cloud can't escape the cell degradation or whatever. And the writers can't escape their obsessive fan fictions, compelling them to write such a flawed and key-jangling script. I seriously don't take this lightly when I say that everybody except for goddamn Sid astronomically screws over the plot or their character development over the course of Rebirth. And all they had to do was improve on a decades-old original source that has a plethora of resources and reviews illustrating how the plot holes in the original can be improved. But that, my dear viewer, is for the next part. Thank you so much for watching, and cheers to the unbridled rage that will be part 2 of my review for Rebirth. Take care.
All's well that ends well, I suppose.
I am so bored right out of my brain. If I don't die first, bet y'all go insane. 'Cause I've got nothing else to do. I'm stuck here wasting time. But just wait, Oh, materia, I'll get back on the road and make you mine.
That's mine.